Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today we have LeClare, Meredith Biesinger, and Fekre Tefera. They will be covering the different perspectives of the education market during the Essa era. I am Dylan Potts with Agile Education Marketing, and I will be moderating this session today. If you have any questions, please ask them in the chat, and they will be addressed after this session. With that being said, Mike, I would love to hand it off to you.
Thanks for that handoff, Dylan. I'm Mike. I work here at Agile Education Marketing. I'm the Compilation Quality Manager. Where we really specialize here at Agile is our specific data sets that we collect and normalize so they're actionable for our clients. Personally, I have about 10 years experience with dealing with education data. And with 10 years experience, we've created plenty of partnerships and relationships at state levels, district levels. We're incredibly education focused. That's the only thing we deal with here at Agile. So we know the education universe. When people have questions about education, because we have employees like Verlin Stevens with nearly 30 years experience in education, myself, the rest of the team, we're able to make sure we can segment the data in a way that's actionable. For this specific webinar, we're going to be building off the previous webinar where I touched base with Essa learning loss, opportunity for learning recovery, gains, and such. We had a very limited universe to look at, but in this webinar, we actually have data that represents coverage of nearly 27 million students in the US, about half the population of the public school universe. So that's kind of the background for me. I'm going to hand it off to Meredith for her introduction. Meredith?
Thank you, Mike. My name is Meredith Biesinger. I am a professional educator and writer. I've been in education for almost 20 years as a high school English teacher, a school administrator, and I currently work as a dyslexia therapist. I also began the Young Mississippi Writers Project as a literacy movement to promote literacy through reading and writing through the art of storytelling, which is something beloved here in the South. And I'm really excited to be here with you today.
Awesome. Thank you, Meredith. My name is Fekre. I am the Director of Analytics at Paper. Kind of built my career solving ambiguous problems for mostly hypergrowth companies, both on the revenue operations and business strategy, and now more so focused on analytics and data science.
All right. With that, what we're going to do for this webinar is we're going to jump in, we're going to go over some of the data, kind of establish a baseline, if you will, to make sure we're all on the same page. Then towards the end, we're going to make sure we get Meredith and Fekre's input on how it's impacted their specific situations and how they're making sure students are in a better place, continually getting in a better place. So we're going to talk about the performance collection process that we have here at Agile. So we've been collecting performance data for nearly 10 years in almost every iteration. Started off as AYP for us, it went to ESEA waivers, and it's currently as reported as Essa data. Essa data, as many of you know, is a state-by-state collection process. No two states are the same as far as how they present it. Sometimes the proficiency data is reported in one file. Sometimes it is quite literally, 20 some odd files with thousands of different data points. Because we've been doing this for so long, we've created those relationships at the state. We make sure there's an understanding on how they're presenting it, how we're understanding it, and how we're making sure we make that actionable for our clients. What we're looking at today for performance is subject-specific proficiency scores, where the state will report they have X% of students proficient. And then the new data point that we've created is trending, where we can show you is that school or district, have they experienced learning gains, have they experienced learning loss, or are they neutral? And that's the one that we're going to be starting off with to make sure everyone's on the same page. So with trending data, what we do is we look at 3 different subjects, ELA, math, and science, as each one's required to be reported per Essa guidelines. Our coverage is about 27 million students, a little above that. We have 40 states currently on file with Essa data. And there's a couple states that still haven't reported their data. So we expect that to climb to 51 because the feds did not hand out any waivers for last year's reporting. Once we look at that trending data to see who's up, who's down at that level, we're going to break it up by Title I. If you're a Title I school or not a Title I school, did that have an impact on gain, loss, or neutral? We're going to look at rural, urban, suburban, and then we're going to dig in at the national, state, district, and school level. So the first one, when you look at the entire universe of all the schools and districts, where did they fall? For non-Title I, you can see about 10% of the schools and districts are in a better spot than they were pre-COVID. Neutral, that's about 5% gains or loss in total proficiency scores. You see about 40%, 50% for loss. You can see if you're a Title I school, although a little difference, the variance wasn't huge. You didn't see Title I schools really struggling as opposed to non-Title I schools. The same's pretty similar for math. You can look at the numbers, gains, 8% compared to 7, neutral, 25 for 21 for math, and then loss, 68 and 72. So if you're trying to break it up, Title I schools experienced a much higher learning loss than non-Title I schools, it's not really the case in this example. So let's look at it another way. Let's look at, rural, suburban, and urban. And again, if you're looking at overall loss, with the exception of rural and math, you're not seeing one group being greatly impacted compared to another one. You can see the neutral data point for rural, suburban, urban, for ELA and math. There's so little variance. If you're reaching out to the same people, if you're reaching out and you're expecting to see the same thing across the board, it's not there. Title I showing you there's very little variance. Rural, suburban, urban showing you there's very little variance. It's really hard to just say this is definitely what happened. You can see that the learning loss in math was higher than the learning loss in ELA. That you can feel pretty comfortable with. The rest, making sure you're getting the right message, that's kind of tricky. So let's go up super high and look at a national level for these gains. For these 27 million students that we are able to categorize in one of these three categories, at the national level, 10% are in a better spot for ELA, 35% are neutral, that plus or minus 5% for their overall proficiency scores, and 55% of those 27 million students are in a significantly worse spot than they were pre-COVID. Math, you can see very similar numbers. 7% are in a better spot. 22% fall into that neutral category. 71% at a national level are in a worse spot than they were pre-COVID. But again, national is a really, really high level. It's great to have an understanding of what's happening in that universe, but we can dig down deeper. We can go to the state level. So looking at this, you can see Pennsylvania compared to the national level, they actually only had 3% gains as opposed to the national of 10%. Neutral was a little lower and loss was significantly higher by almost 20%. Looking at the math for Pennsylvania, again, you're seeing similar trends, a little closer to the national average. But again, you have to make sure you keep on drilling down to make sure there's an understanding of who you're talking to. So we're at national, we're at state. Let's look at state and district and schools now. Again, you've seen these numbers before for Pennsylvania, excuse me, gain 3%, 25, 72. Well, let's look at Philadelphia. You can see that their gains were a little higher than Pennsylvania. Where there's a big difference is in their neutral and loss categories. 81% of the students within Philadelphia are in a worse spot than they were pre-COVID for ELA, close to 80 or right around 80% for math. And again, we can just keep on digging down because you don't want to craft your message the same for everybody in Philadelphia. You want to make sure if you're one of the schools that were neutral or even had a gain, you're not addressing them as a school that experienced a loss. So we can take two schools in this example, Henry W. Lawton Elementary. They actually are in a better spot than they were. They were part of that 4% that were in a better spot than they were pre-COVID. Carver Engineering and Science High School, they were a loss for ELA. Now, if you look at math, they flipped. Carver Engineering actually saw a gain. They were one of the 3% of the schools in Philadelphia that were in a better spot. Henry Lawton, they experienced a loss. So again, we just keep on digging down, and you can see you have to make sure you're understanding who you're talking to, because if you're not understanding who you're talking to and what they've experienced, your message is going to be lost. So this next one's kind of interesting from the standpoint, we created a graph where we wanted to show every school in Philadelphia that we were able to get broken into these three categories. This one's for ELA, that gain, loss, and neutral. And what we did, we just looked at the proficiencies used to obtain those metrics. Lawton Elementary, you can see they're about 35%, post-COVID is a very loose term, but currently they're about 35% proficient with ELA, where they were about 29% proficient previously. You can also look at Carver, and you can see that they're lower. In 2019, they were around 35%, I believe, and you can see they've dipped quite a bit. And what this is this is just a representation of 200 schools sorted by highest to lowest for their 2019 ELA scores, English Language Arts, and you can see the volatility that they've experienced with their current round of tests. We did the same thing for math as well. As you remember, 3% of schools were in a better spot than they were. Carver was one of them. Lawton was not. And you can see test scores for math are significantly down across the board in Philadelphia. And making sure you understand what these schools and students and teachers have experienced, how they're trying to tackle it, how you can provide services to make sure they can raise this up. This is what this data shows you. It shows you how to relate to them and make sure you can craft a message that resonates with them. Now, we've kind of created a baseline. Everybody sees that learning loss has been experienced at a significant level nationally, and that it's really, really hard to break it up where Title I schools are always this. Rural, suburban, urban are always this. You really have to go in and you have to look at the data. What we're going to do now is we're going to hand it over to Fekre, and he's going to talk about his experience. And then we're going to kind of open it up and talk about some group experiences that we've all experienced from an education aspect, a tutoring providing aspect, and we'll get to see where that goes. So with that, Fekre, you want to run with it?
So what we do here at Paper is provide an unlimited model for tutoring and essay support, writing review for all districts that we partner with. These districts have different needs, and in order to highlight where we need to serve them, Agile has been providing us with data both on learning loss and other information that are going to help us highlight where the needs are, as well as where we can catch them. Our model really fits in well with an equitable model, and in that we provide 24/7 unlimited support, so districts are not capped by how many hours they need to use us. We have those same 200 subjects in over 4 languages, which means that you have a breadth of students that you can reach. And right now, it's a scalable model, enough so that we can scale up to 5 million students, of which 2 million are already working with us. So to your point, Mike, we have a granularity need, right? If districts and schools are behaving so differently from one another, yet on average, we see learning loss, that means that we need to get lower in and understand where we have the most amount of opportunities to address learning loss. So with that said, some schools will resemble others in different districts more than they would in the ones in the same district. We also need to start addressing those that have the largest amount of learning loss, but also look at historic, because where you end up in 2019 is going to determine how much of a loss you have. And if you are already struggling, and if you struggled maybe less than others saw in terms of drop off, that still means that we have to address your needs. And lastly, there's a subject and grade level that you need to consider, in the sense that there's a compound effect where lower grades are going to be impacted now, and you might not see as much learning loss, but there's going to be a spillover effect as those students age, because they're going to fall behind their peers in later grades. You have other issues like access to technology, where not everyone necessarily has access to Wi-Fi in all places in the US. So even within the same district, you're going to have a lot of different challenges for different students. And then you also don't always have access to after-hours support, after-school support, whether that be because you can't afford it, whether you don't have the technology for it, or whether you don't have the time for it, i.e. you're working late in the evening after school. We still need to consider those students. And in order to do that, we need to look at this learning loss more at a granular school level, at least school grade level, in order to see where the largest opportunities are. With that, I'll hand it off to Meredith, because I think you've had some interesting points on what you see in the actual schools, and how the students are suffering or succeeding during these times.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think sometimes the word data in the K-12 sector can be viewed as a bad word, but really data is essential in all that we do. That's how we learn where our gaps are. That's how we learn where we need to improve. I do believe, though, that sometimes data is just believed to be testing. And I think we all know that we test our students quite a bit now, more than we ever have. And testing is important. I mean, that's how we figure out where those learning gaps are, like you mentioned. But our students are more than a test score, and so are our teachers. And no two students learn the same. And so when your state department, or the country as a whole, makes these decisions of this is how our students will learn, this is the curriculum that they will use, you're isolating a lot of students. And you're isolating their needs, and you're also isolating their strengths at a lot of times. And so this overkill on testing has kind of muted individual strengths and individual success in our students. But what we can do, which I think you are doing at Paper, is use our data wisely, and not just to rank our schools or students and their teachers, but use it as a guided response to their needs. And look at individual schools, look at individual students, see where those learning gaps are, where those deficiencies are, and make a plan to bridge those. Also look at where they're really excelling, and keep that rate going. We don't want to lose that momentum. Educators and stakeholders just need to take a breath and spend some time and resources on looking at data and their students as assets, where everyone belongs, where everyone can find a learning path, so to speak, that works for them. Educators don't need to give up traditional classroom tests altogether. I think there's this whole movement where we don't test, or we test too much, and not all tests are wrong or harmful or invalid, because again, we need that data. We need to know where our students are. We need to know where teachers need to improve, as well as students. So when that data is utilized correctly, and that those tests are administered with the correct format and timing and content, research has proven testing to be valuable. However, it needs to be done with a clear purpose, and not just test just to test. We all know that tests don't teach, teachers do. And so there's been a lot of funding that has been spent on new educational initiatives and things that are going to be a cure-all that will work. And often those are needed. They are. However, sometimes I feel personally that we don't think about our thinking. And what I mean by that is that all students don't think the same. Not all teachers think the same. We learn differently. And so we need to use our data to design educational philosophies, at least at a school-wide level, to build a positive school culture for our students and for our educators. One of the things that we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of educators leave the field in droves. And a lot of that is because school culture, educational philosophies are maybe not aligned with, what they feel it was like 10, 20 years ago or 5 years ago. And so they want to teach their students, and they want to use that data to create a positive experience for their students and also for themselves and their colleagues. So data can be key in cultivating successful students, but also successful teachers, because we are all learning and growing each year too, and trying to be the best teachers that we can be so that our students can be the best that they can be.
One of the most interesting points you brought up, Meredith, is that we keep introducing new programs again and again. So what I've noticed is teachers, principals, even district leaders, what they ended up doing is, okay, so if we keep introducing multiple programs all at the same time, first of all, you can't focus on one. So you don't even know what works because you haven't given it time to actually flourish and get adopted. So there's a huge difference for us between districts that say, okay, how long does it actually take us to implement systems and get everyone on board? 2 years, 3 years, and in education, most systems take 3 years or so to get everyone acclimated. Those districts, we find the adoption from teachers, the buy-in from students is absolutely higher than the ones that want to try us out for a year, because it's just like taking on a subject. You don't just try it; you have to really invest yourself in it and say, "I'm gonna get it right." So from an educator point of view, in your case, do you think that it's tougher to have these changes as a teacher, or do you think the students have an even harder time with it?
That's a really excellent question, because I think children are more adaptable to change than adults. Adults, we kind of get stuck on our ways sometimes, and we like what we like. And so I do think it's easier for students to adapt. However, when you're building a learning foundation, as a young student especially, that inconsistency is confusing and it's conflicting. And I do think, studies have shown that consistency is important in a child's education. And I think you're seeing a lot of schools trying to consolidate into, a K-5 setting if they can, so that they're not having to switch schools in the middle of their primary education. I think curriculum needs to be consistent. Your intervention needs to be consistent. And so, and even diving into a little bit of social and emotional learning there, students who come from home lives that maybe are not consistent, they crave that consistency in their lives as a student, because sometimes that's the only place where they get it. So it's a very lengthy answer to your question.
Verlin's, I'll steal this story from Verlin. His son's an assistant principal at a high school, and his comment was, the kids came back feral. Like they're not, like, they don't have the same like manners. And
yes, this is true. I can speak to that.
Well, yeah. and like, that's the stuff that, like, the data shows that people are struggling with it, but like that's something else that I think is important for this conversation.
One of the things that we've noticed is delinquencies on the app have gone up. So situations where people use a lot of swear words, where students are mean to tutors, where they're commenting on, ad hominems or whatever. That said, I think the area, if we say support, that means addressing these two, right? You can't kick those students out.
Not just the learning loss. It's refocusing on some widely accepted social norms, or however we want to say it. Like, that's important.
So much of school, I mean, is academics, but it's also a social learning experiment. And so when you have children that have been out of a social environment for a couple years, or young ones that never started with that foundation and just jumped right into second grade without really attending a traditional kindergarten or first grade, then you have gaps.
Yeah.
Your best parents can't replicate a school setting, I mean, just the things that you would learn there. So
there's even additional data, throughout the years that we've been collecting this. When they went away from AYP to the ESEA waivers, states all of a sudden had the freedom to test however they wanted. And for the next several years, you saw a lot of states adjusting which tests they are administering. Sometimes they were really state specific. Sometimes there is a group of states that got together and did NECAP for New England area, or maybe it was Smarter Balanced, or maybe it was ACT Aspire. And you saw this evolution of, okay, this wasn't quite working. Okay, this isn't quite working. And to kind of build on that a little bit, Fekre, you and I were talking about it. Meredith, I think, talking to my teacher friends, they've experienced this, and I'm assuming you have too. What happens when a state constantly moves the bar or adjusts testings? Like, oh, we're going from this test to this test. What's that do for you as like a teacher?
So I'm making notes, and I just wrote down 5 minutes ago that consistency is key, but one of the problems is that it's been so inconsistent. And so you have this thing that is ever changing, and teachers, it can't catch up. So if teachers can't catch up, how can you get your students caught up? And then this could be a whole other webinar, but then there's the issue of the box, right? The students that fit in the box will likely succeed, but there's a lot outside of the box, and we design these curriculums and things like that just fit this one population of students and not the others. And so learning loss has been happening for a long time, but like your special needs students, they took a huge hit because they were already getting intervention, and that intervention just stopped for at least a year, maybe two. And so now you have learning loss with these huge, dips across the board, because your mainstream students have learning loss, but your special needs students have severe learning loss. Because if you are a student who needs speech, you can't really get speech services at home.
Anytime we collected the data, almost always we got that disclaimer saying it's a new test this year, scores are going to be lower. And what you saw is it took about 2 years for everybody to feel more comfortable with it, i.e., to give the teachers the tools to make sure that the students can understand how it's going to be administered. I'm not saying tests determine how well a student is performing, but as far as the numbers that are being reported at the state level, it took about 2 years before you started seeing real returns. And that's, patience is hard in tough times. And what the data shows is, if you're on the right track, patience is generally highly rewarded, assuming you're on the right track.
Right. It's a life lesson too.
You won't even try to get on the right track if you know that things are always going to shift.
Yeah.
So there's also that buy-in aspect, right? If you knew that you had to put in time to actually learn a curriculum or a system or whatever it may be, but you're still doubting whether they're going to be around next year, you're not going to invest as much time to get to know that system or curriculum, etc.
Absolutely.
This is how I look at data, and data is only as good as what operationally you've been able to do on the ground and what you've been able to capture. So Meredith mentioned something earlier, tests don't teach, teachers do. That's true. And tests are only just a lagging indicator of that teaching, to a degree, even. The same way as when we say learning loss, well, that's testing score as well. But there are other things that we know, even from your data sets at Agile, that are indicators of lagging maybe, but truer indicators of how bad we are doing. One of them is anything to do with delinquencies. So increase in bullying, increase in any of the situations that we notice in school are an indicator of how healthy that community is, right? Because that's ultimately what a school is. It's a community of students and teachers that are trying to navigate these like testing times. So the data adds flavor to that, or adds some color to that, and lets us know, okay, where do I actually need to focus on from a comparative standpoint? It's not to say that you're going to tell the same message to every school either. A school district in California with lockdown times that are much higher than that of maybe Mississippi or Texas will have a different experience of that same learning loss. Even if two schools have the same learning loss, the way you lost it is different. You can also consider another point that I've also heard from some of our partners, which is when you say learning loss, you assume that we had a baseline that was working. And that's a discussion that we used to have, which is if you compare the US education system to anyone in the OECD, we rank right near the bottom. And then you add on, 14th, right around the bottom. And then you add in the layer during COVID. And then you add in the historic discrepancy between like different schools, for example. So you have some schools that would not have passed the smell test in any other country as being an actual school that is at performance. And knowing that 70% learning loss was then experienced on top of that means that we have an urgent need in education and we have to address it right now. That means stopping the bleeding. And then next is more foundational. That is like reforming the system. But first you gotta stop the bleeding first. If you have a significant part of your population that went through collective trauma over the past 2 years, whether that is losing parents, grandparents, family members, even if you never locked your schools up, you have experienced learning loss to a degree, right? That stuff we don't have, but we can feel it, and we're going to feel it over incoming years. So data is not a limiting factor. Data just should orient us a little bit more so that we can quantify or qualify where we need to put focus on as all of us. So it's not the full story, it's just a start of where you start asking questions.
I think that's spot on, Fekre. It helps paint the story. And making sure you understand it and interpret it in the correct way really, really helps out. And so many people agree with that. You know, there's an EdWeek article just, released a little bit ago, and they were talking how important it is. They surveyed a bunch of district level personnel, and one of the highest ways for them to look at the emails was make sure you know what you're talking about, make it relatable, show that you understand, like you're saying, well, California had longer lockdowns. Make sure you have that understanding before you reach out, because whether it's learning loss or gains or neutral, there's so many other things that go into it. And just having an understanding and being able to put that mosaic together, that's how you reach people and can ultimately start improving on students' experience, where, like you're saying, they have the buy-in. It's going to be really difficult to get back to where we were, but it's feasible. And it's when people are working together and understand that, the experience impacted everybody so differently, and making sure that you're getting that taste with the different data or different personal experiences is so important when you're reaching out.
Absolutely. And I think you're speaking more so on reaching out when it comes to non-partners or potential future partners. That's super important to add that perspective to someone making calls and reaching out to people. There's a certain sense of context that unless you understand the district's needs, you're going to offer them the wrong message. So even if the solution was right, the messaging doesn't fit. So no partnership gets done.
So Meredith, do you have like any examples of that like happening? Like you got a message from someone, someone trying to reach out, trying to help out, and you're like, oh my gosh, I just missed the mark so bad. Or
I do. I was just thinking about, I was at a conference in Arizona this past summer in Phoenix. And I was speaking about Mississippi and a large struggle that Mississippi had specifically during COVID, but in general is internet options and especially in these rural areas. And so you had children who did not have internet to get on a Zoom call to talk to their teacher or to get on to Google Classroom and do things. And some of their parents made efforts to go to, McDonald's parking lot to connect to that Wi-Fi to do that. Others didn't or couldn't do that. And so when I'm talking about this, people in Phoenix are looking at me like, wait, what? You didn't have internet to do their schooling? It's like, yes, that's a huge deal here. We just received government funding to open up, fiber internet in these pockets of areas that there's never even been internet before in 2022 or 2021. And so that's something that's specific to, rural areas that you don't find in, your heavily populated cities.
Yeah. So if you're, somebody's reaching out for you about all these technology aspects and options for you, you're like, yeah, man, it's not going to touch these students that I needed to touch, let's.
Yes. And I actually wrote an article about this, about heaven forbid anything like this happens again, which, we surely hope it doesn't, how just a hybrid curriculum that was consistent, that could be used on paper at home or on the internet at home, that is self-guided, would be a huge offering for, like an ed tech or curriculum company to put out there, because it would service a lot of different demographics of students.
Yeah, absolutely. And states are different, but then as you put it, Meredith, even the schools within the state are going to be different. That rural school in the middle of Mississippi.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even after you go rural in Mississippi, then you have socio kind of economic groups within those same kind of like areas.
Yes. Mm-hmm. There's layers, right? It's like peeling back an onion. So.
Absolutely. So even though solutions don't fit everyone, educators like yourself, you also have extra specializations to help those that need that little extra support. Can you talk about how that impacted your work, like specifically dealing with students that are a little bit more underserved or need a little bit more support?
Sure. So just a small backstory. A lot of people will ask, why did you, transfer or make this switch from being a school administrator to a dyslexia therapist? My heart and passion is literacy, and living in the Deep South, there's a great need for literacy. And then I have a son with a speech praxia and dyslexia. And so he actually kind of inspired me to change fields a little bit, because I wanted to help him the best that I could. And in doing that, I just fell in love with it, and then wanted to help other students as well. And so it's very difficult to work with students on a Zoom phone call, or if they can't do that, to work on, in reading and things like that. And so I see huge losses coming back from school lockdowns and or hybrid schooling, and just the inconsistencies that have taken place over the last couple of years, because they need that consistent daily intervention and those practices to help them get ahead and move along. So now we're trying to compensate for that and do our best.
Thank you for sharing that story. I did not realize the why, but I knew that you did work with students with any type of speech impediment. And funny enough, I had a counselor as well myself when I was in high school, and I think we're so fortunate, I mean, your son included, and the students in your classroom, to have something that is recognized as, oh, this bright, young person might struggle in the future if we don't address it right now. I think the next question becomes, how many Merediths are there in the world that are going to do that, right? I think that's the next step in education. It's like, how often are we actually reaching, how often do we have experts that can reach those students?
I think to that too, because early intervention is so key. How many students have we missed over the last couple of years? School districts have been locked down, and those testing resources haven't been available, and there haven't been educators there to notice, I think there might be an issue there that we need to address. And so that's my concern, is how many students have been overlooked just because we haven't been there in person to address it. And so I think you're going to see a huge uptick, and you're already seeing it already in IEPs. And then how many teachers, are you staffed with to help with that growing number of, intervention needs?
At the end of this, the data does tell the story. It helps paint that picture, create that mosaic, whatever you want to say. It makes sure you're making your message relatable, making sure you can show some empathy and reach out to potential clients and understand what they're dealing with. From our standpoint on Agile, like I said, we've been collecting this data for years, 10 plus years just on the performance data. So we feel comfortable. And if you don't feel comfortable, reach out to us. We can walk you through it. Bottom line, looking at Meredith's experiences, Fekre's experiences, and Agile's experience, know your audience, relate to your audience. That helps you be part of the solution, and a solution that's actionable and impactful to kids that are either really excelling in their current situation or might need a little extra help, especially with everything going on these past couple of years. So reach out to us if you have any questions. And once again, I'd really like to thank Meredith and Fekre for your time today. You guys were great.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Fekre, Meredith, and Mike, for a great presentation on the different perspectives of the education market during the Essa era. If you know anyone that cannot make it today, there will be an email sent out with the link, and it will also be added to our YouTube channel. If you have any questions on the topics presented today, please reach out to see how our team can answer them and help. If you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel, this is a wonderful way to catch up on all our past webinar recordings. Again, thank you for joining us today, and have a great day.